Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Lee Artz joins me as we examine global news agencies and how they influence not only what we read in the newspapers, but also what we get through social media. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Lee Artz. Dr. Artz recently published an article and a lead book chapter on global news agencies. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to be on this side.
Yeah. So why don't we get started with explaining what global news agencies are, and then we can talk about generally why people should know about them and why that's important.
Yeah, often we don't know that there's global news agencies at work that are collecting and distributing news, and they've been around for 100, 150 years. The Associated Press, it's probably more than 150 years now. Yeah. There's Reuters, and there's Agence France Presse, which is AFP, the French. There were many more years ago, but news agencies, both national and global, have become more important with the decline of the press.
Yeah.
There's now something like 35 million newspaper readers in the U.S. When you think about it, that's less than 10% of the population's reading a newspaper. So what has happened is that as the newspapers have shrunk in their attempt to remain profitable, they've had to cut back on investigative reporting. It costs a lot of money, and international reporting. A paper like the Chicago Tribune used to have international bureaus in Europe and around. They can't afford that anymore. So news agencies like Associated Press fill that vacuum of news.
Yeah.
The Associated Press, for instance, has 240 some odd news bureaus in 120 countries. So they actually still have reporters in countries around the world, and they provide the news and information that local papers need or local televisions need.
And this is really what they've always done. It's just that we're more dependent on them now.
They've always done that. I mean, AP started as a nonprofit kind of a coalition. American newspapers banded together. Again, they were trying to save money. So instead of sending out 20 reporters from 20 papers, they'd send out one reporter from the Associated Press. It was called a non-profit association because the members of the Associated Press would give an annual contribution, and then they in return would get news stories. Yeah, and it becomes more important because if a newspaper wants to report on international news, first of all, there's less and less of it. Yeah. But to the extent that they do, they have to get the information from somewhere. So in the case of the US and most of Europe, that's from the Associated Press. They say that over half of the world reads an Associated Press story every day, which means they have tremendous power to relate to us from their perspective what's happened in the world.
And so in your article, you've looked into how they're reporting the news and how the news might be biased by the way they're reporting it because of the extraordinary influence that it has.
When we do media studies, one thing we know is that the media can frame how we understand the world. So just having information doesn't give us knowledge, and I would even argue knowledge doesn't give us an understanding. There has to be some interpretation. There has to be multiple diverse points of view. So from that, we can kind of assemble some understanding. But when we think about the power of Associated Press in particular, they make more than 100,000 videos, news videos every year. And they now conform to what you might call the CNN standard. Little sound bites, spectacular pictures, dramatic events, crises, conflicts. And why? Because their corporate members want things that will attract an audience, which means short, dramatic, spectacle, and so they provide that on a global scale.
That's not really unique and new though, because the sound bite's always been shrinking, right? Going back to, I think I've seen some comparisons of sound bites when you go back to the Walter Cronkite era, the Huntley Brinkley era, and it's like a minute 30-second sound bite, and then you look at the sound bite of a similar sound bite 10 years later, and it's 30 seconds, and then it's it gets to be 10 seconds and 5 seconds.
And I would say that you're right. This is not something new. What's new is that it's being organized on a global scale, and I would argue it pushes us even further. because I don't think it's a genetic predisposition that humans have not to be able to manage a thought for more than 10 seconds.
Yeah.
It may appear that if you're using social media or if you're watching even a romantic comedy on television or something, because it changes like every 3 seconds, which kind of conditions us for what we want. And from the point of view of selling something, it makes great sense. From the point of view of increasing our understanding, it kind of interferes with that. So, and I would say, incidentally, one of the questions when I first began doing this research, well, kind of who cares? Because everybody's using social media. There's 200 million websites, and that's where people. Well, the interesting thing is, the overwhelming news source on social media are the primary news creators, New York Times, Washington Post. 98% of the Yahoo feeds of news comes from AP. Associated Press is the primary source for Facebook. So yes, people are using social media, but they're distributors, they're aggregators, they're bundlers. They're not the producers of news. So you have to step back and say, well, where did that meme come from? Or where did that thing go viral? Where did it start? And it primarily starts, nowadays, there's a handful, New York Times, the Post, but probably more importantly on a global scale, it's Associated Press and Reuters. And it has a tremendous impact on how we understand an event somewhere on the other side of the world.
So there's the length of the articles becomes shorter.
Yes.
And viewers maybe remember seeing movies, or if they're as old as we are, they might remember newsrooms, right, where there was this click, 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 click in the background all the time. That was the wire service machine clicking off these strings of copy, and they would be long, stories essentially, and then the newspaper would decide how much of it they wanted to use. But you're saying even the length of these stories now is greatly reduced.
The length of the stories is reduced, and the timing that they come out, so that they, I mean, we're talking videos of 400 or 500 videos every day that come out to 5,000 television stations around the world. Daily newspapers that get that, and again, because they are there for profit, not primarily for as a public resource, the window for international news is this big now. And that means they want something that's concise, but also attracts attention.
And even national news too, because even on a national level, we're dependent on this.
This is right. The only thing about the Associated Press, it's probably, when I began looking at this, it's probably one of the least researched, least attended to I mean, everybody has seen exposés of everything from Disney to the New York Times to the
60 Minutes
Sun, 60 Minutes, yes. But the Associated Press, because it's nonprofit and it's been around for so long, it kind of rises to this level of journalist purity. If you want objective news, you get it firsthand from some reporter that's on site, and we can count on that being the full picture.
And it's nonprofit because it's owned by newspapers, which of course are for profit, but so it does have that link.
I in the paper I call it a concierge of private news, because they're the ones that filter it, package it, prepare it, and deliver it to those that are going to deliver it to us as consumers. So
now you're not looking at this because you're interested in the entertainment side of it. You're looking at this because you're concerned that it reduces our capacity to have a public discourse on issues of national importance. In other words, it constrains our ability to function as citizens in a democracy, right? How is it that it has that impact? How would you?
Well, I actually got to this because much of the research I've done recently has been on media entertainment and global entertainment. And the interesting thing is how much news parallels entertainment, such that we see that we're always constantly under attack. The next threat of some evildoer is going to pop up from the football field, and we have to. And so when the news kind of parallels that entertainment, it's not hard for us to wrap our heads around it. And because we no longer are asked or allowed or encouraged to go into detail, we get it in the same kind of sound bites, the same kind of action things that an action movie or some animation might. But you're absolutely right. We still believe that the news somehow is in this privileged location where this is just entertainment. But the news follows many of the same techniques that the entertainment does, because the news has become a commodity, and to attract the audience, it's like what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's got to be spectacular. It's got to be dramatic. It's got to tug at your human heartstrings. It's got to do all of these things, and it's got to do it again the next day. It's got to do it this afternoon. It's got to do it all the time, because there's this battle among, the remaining papers and the remaining TV networks to grab viewers.
So let's talk about news as a commodity. You can buy it, you can sell it, right? It can be packaged.
Yes.
That's always been the case, right? I mean, I think Habermas says once the newspaper started selling advertising over 100 years ago, they were relieved of the burden of their conscience, I think is how he phrased it, and they started treating news as a commodity.
Yes, but I would say it hasn't always been the case, and even now it's not always the case. It's something that is the result of the commercialization of the media. I mean, we have the models from Europe, but BBC has been a big model. News for the public interest. They don't even have TV hosts, news hosts. They're readers. They're simply reading the news, or in Germany or in Sweden, the public news is there as a public resource. Right. The US is probably the prime example of where it's always been commercialized. It started out as an advertising medium, and then what are you going to sell to the audience that you want them to see advertisements? Well, you would sell them news. Yeah. And it's a commodity, just like this cup is or this paper is. And it means you want to cut your costs, you want to deliver it as quickly and efficiently as possible, and you want to be able to sell it again tomorrow. Yeah. Which is, to understand, I don't know, the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or to understand the sanctions against Venezuela, you can't get that in a soundbite. I mean, they gave us a soundbite with a change in immigration, and we see these pictures. We get the information. Kids in cages. Oh my God, right? But that's information. We don't get the knowledge that those pictures were from the Obama administration. Yeah. And then, even if we have that knowledge, we don't have the understanding what drives U.S. immigration. Why are there conflicts over this? Or even what drives people leaving one place? Nobody gets to be 18 or 20 and says, I think I'll move to a country halfway around the globe. That takes some understanding. But when news is a commodity, something that's produced for quick consumption, a sound bite or a video bite, we can't understand it. So we believe we have information, which we do, and I wouldn't say that AP is not giving us accurate information, but it's a selection for
and a limited selection.
A very limited selection. And in that sense, it would, if we get to some of the things that I discovered, we'll see that their selection that they chose, while accurate, may not be the full picture. It'd be like looking out of a window on the side of your house doesn't let you know what's on the front porch. So.
Well, before we get to that, just if we can do this briefly, probably can't, but what's the alternative? Because, if you think about the history of democracy, right, if you go back to ancient Greece, there were maybe 5,000 people that were actually participating in the democracy in Athens, right? So it was a small group. They had similar education. They could talk to one another if they wanted to. When you get to the Enlightenment era in the United States, right, you've got mass democracies, and it's not possible for information to travel by word of mouth. So how do we do this if we don't use these news agencies? What's the alternative?
Well,
here?
It's not possible to travel by word of mouth, but it is possible for news to travel with whatever the technology is, radio, television, or now digital communication. And what this suggests is this method of producing and distributing news is not in the public interest. I mean, it strongly suggests that commercial media for profit does not serve democracy. It raises the question of how would you and I have access to media to tell stories? Or how would people that are in another place be able to tell their story? And there's actually examples. I mean, I think the BBC is a modest example. National Public Radio is a modest example. A more robust one in my mind is what's happened in Latin America in the last 20 years in Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, even to some extent in Argentina, where whole communities have access to producing their own radio, their own television, their own newspapers. And that changes, it's not like you have public service which means I'm going to do a service for you, but you have public access where the participants can actually produce their own videos, their shorts, and they can be broadcast nationwide, and there's no reason they couldn't be broadcast internationally. I mean, when you think about it right now, if you said, what should the U.S. do with Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen, or what should the U.S. do about immigration? Everybody just about has a cell phone. Get out, stop funding, release the prisoners.
Right.
And we have that ability to do that.
I mean, but I don't assume that everybody wants to do that. I don't know that everybody cares.
Well, that's the first time I've heard that argument. The argument argument we usually hear is,
let's face it,
we don't know as much as who? The Congress people? They don't have a clue. They don't read the laws that they pass. The information that it's open to debate. It's open to discourse. Yes, that can happen also. I'm not advocating this as the only solution. I'm just saying here's an example of how the media technology could be used in a democratic way.
And I appreciate hearing that.
And I realize there's some fallacies and there's some obstacles in there.
Yeah.
But it's certainly, I would argue, it's superior to having a handful of people determining what we get in the news since yesterday.
So you're looking at, what I would describe as more of a partisan press model. If you look at the early days of the U.S. after the Constitution was ratified, right? Yeah. There were papers for every political. Paris was like this during the French Revolution, right? There were people putting out papers and handbills on just about from every perspective you could want. And so somebody, by reading a number of things, would get a general sense of what was going on, right? But the main issue now, if I can paraphrase this a little bit, right, is that we've got one or two sources claiming to be objective and filtering everything through that
and I wouldn't
frame, right?
dispute their. It's kind of what do we mean by objective, but I'm not suggesting that the New York Times or Associated Press, although there are instances, but in general they don't misquote, they don't create something that didn't happen. But it's more effective because it's a form of framing. Yeah. So, and if we talk about that a bit, it might become clear. Well,
let's go to framing. Okay, so you talk about this neoliberal ethos and this neoliberal frame that these agencies frame the news in. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that might be a concept that, I arrive at that conclusion. I didn't start with that, but I arrive at that conclusion that says that because the AP is gathering news to distribute to commercial media, they also are interested in delivering the news that the commercial media wants, which means it has to have a certain perspective. And one of those is that the market rules. If there's something that's a problem, it's because it affects the market. So it's okay if MBS executes people by cutting off their heads in Saudi Arabia, as long as the price of oil stays high. So we will call MBS a reformer, because compared to some, he's a reformer. But the thing that drives it is that the market should make that decision. So austerity becomes something that's a partisan thing. So if people are thrown out of work, if they lose their pensions, if the public resources are sold like in Greece, well, then the Greeks were simply profligate in spending, and they were like little children. Really? To have a pension, to have a decent income, to have public resources? But that would be the way.
There were a lot of patronage jobs in Greece, I think. But in addition to that,
understandable. Yes. So, I didn't come to that conclusion, but by understanding that how they would frame news, and it was framed by choice of sources. Who do I go to tell me what's happening? It was framed by, even after I do that, how do people understand who they are? So I will use evaluative adjectives. And then the final thing is, I give no context. If there is no context, you can frame it almost any way you want, right? Like if
there's always context, so you're giving it some context. It might be too broad, it might be too vague.
The context is like the spectacle of an action movie. There's the chase, that's the context. There's no context of why are they chasing, what are they going to do when they get, right? That's gone. So in the few places that I looked at, and since I published the essay, I've continued to do this and presented at a conference last year, but I did Crimea, I did Syria, the U.S. missile attack on Syria, I did the Venezuelan elections. Since then, I've done the U.S. involvement in Yemen. I've done the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela.
Yeah.
And I find these techniques, they are recurrent. So it's not like it's not like one reporter. I would argue this is the template that Associated Press uses.
So just give us an example here. I thought you had a really good example with Crimea. You talked about how the Ukrainian side of the issue was based on interviews with all of these people with important titles, and then when they wanted the Crimean side of the issue, they went to a former Russian military officer who was living in the Crimea.
Well, one thing I found is...
walk us through that example.
Right. Well, one thing I found, first thing, is that the sources that were used were just not balanced.
Yeah.
So there were twice as many sources that the Associated Press used to oppose what was a referendum in Crimea of whether they wanted to return to Russia or remain in the Ukraine. In the other cases, I found as many as 4-to-1 sources that were favorable to a particular perspective versus one side. So even the balance. But then the second part...
So a reporter selects who's going to be interviewed and quoted, and so if the reporter selects people that have prestige or important titles or something on the one side, and then select the same number.
Even if they select the same number. Yeah. First of all, the numbers
if they have less credibility, the story's still slanted.
If there was an imbalance, it was in the number of sources from certain perspectives, and there always were only 2 perspectives, which anybody that lives in the world knows there's multiple, but you only get 2. And
that's
then
an inherent problem with the whole concept of objective reporting.
Yes, you give 2. And then the second thing is that you hit it right on the head. How are we going to describe this source for our reader?
Right.
And the readers would be told in Crimea, well, these are ethnic Ukrainians, i.e. the Ukrainians. The others were either ethnic Russians or Russian spokespeople, i.e. Russia's intervening.
Right.
And that's the way it's presented. In the case of Venezuela, it's even more harsh. Like the elected government of Chavez and Maduro, 67% of the electorate puts him in office. He's called an authoritarian. But the opposition always in front of opposition, it says democratic opposition.
Yeah.
Even though they have participated in illegal acts, they've sabotaged, they've burnt people alive, they're still called the democratic opposition. I think
this was the case with the Ukrainian government, right? I mean, they basically overthrew the elected government in Ukraine.
And they financed fascist groups, and NATO was kind of wooing the Ukraine in opposition to what Reagan told Gorbachev they were going to do. And you add to that there is no, when you get to the context, there's no context in the sense that this is acceptable electoral procedure, like in the case of Venezuela. Or this is in violations of the United Nations Resolution 2118 in the case of Syria, where the U.S. unilaterally sent 17 missiles to a site in Syria. I mean, if you want to impeach Trump, there's the reason. He just violated international law.
I don't want to impeach him. He's too entertaining.
Yes. Well, yeah, I would assume Associated Press likes him, and Duterte and what's it, Bolsonaro and some of the others, because they provide spectacle, they provide attract an audience. Absolutely. So.
Which goes back to what you were saying about the similarities between the news and the
entertainment.
We eventually elect an entertainer to be president, right? Yeah.
But this media framing, when you look at it, it's like, well, that's true. They quoted that source completely accurately. They didn't make that up. And like in Venezuela, when the AP reported on voting, they said, well, there wasn't any line at this voting booth.
Right.
That's true. But where was the voting booth?
What time were they there?
There's 110 of them, and you're going to talk to me about one? It's like you say, you select your sources, you select the sites, you select the events that you want to
create
cover,
the context,
and that creates information. But I would argue it doesn't create much understanding.
Yeah.
It's easy to dismiss a source simply by giving an adjective in the front or a connector. Like if you said, what, Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen are the reason that the Saudis bombing them. Well, we know you don't like Iranian-backed Houthis. That sounds right. That's not.
Right.
But if you say And you don't include the Saudi prince who is dropping U.S. bombs, flying planes that are U.S. planes by pilots that were trained by the U.S., and the U.S. is providing in-air logistics and in-air refueling so they don't have to go back to fuel so they can drop more bombs. But you don't say the U.S.-backed regime of MBS. That doesn't. The point is, they're both accurate.
Yeah.
But one kind of helps us understand from a certain perspective, and that's unfortunate.
Okay, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Artz for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.